This is Suzanne's area, and I just wanted to publicly thank Suzanne for taking this on as co-chair. But you are really much more involved with this area of research than I am. So, in the interest of time, Irina is going to talk for how long?
25. I mean, I can go for a minute or two, but I hope I
For
won't
1
exceed.
minute or two?
Yeah, well, I mean,
Oh,
25 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, I may
think you're gonna
exceed
get this done in 1 minute or
2 minutes,
two.
but I hope I will be.
Yeah, 1 minute, okay, done. So she's going to talk for a bit about her dissertation. The four of us who are in this room have read this, Suzanne and I, many times. And at the end of that, we will see if the committee members have questions for Irina. Then we will open it up to anybody else who's here for questions. At that point, when that's done, we will ask Irina to leave for a few minutes, but not to go far. So, go for it.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming here to support me. It's really great to see so many faces that I love and I haven't seen for so long. And as you can see, my dissertation title is Remarkable U.S. English Like on a University Campus, Non-Native Usage, Judgments, and Attitudes. And before I start describing the study itself, I would like to make kind of two warnings. The first is because the study is transdisciplinary and some of the methods I use are common in sociolinguistics, but not so much in second language acquisition studies. So I will have to spend a little more time than usual explaining the methodology, which will in turn have make me kind of gloss over some of the minor findings and literature review. But I have extra slides with details. If any questions arise afterwards, I will be able to. I hope I will be able to answer them. And yeah, also for the sake of time, I have my cards to help me through that. Okay, thank you. Yeah. First of all, I need to introduce Remarkable Like, the focus of my dissertation. This is a quote from one of my participants, a young man from the Dominican Republic. Like I use it, but then I'll be like, okay, I'm using it too much. Like right now, I just need to no, I don't have to use like in that sentence. From this quote, it should be pretty evident what kind of like I'm talking about. But methodologically, Darcy provided a very elegant and useful distinction that helps us understand this difference that has been probably perceptually available to the native speakers of English all along. The difference between the unremarkable or grammatical like, which is the verb like, I like cats, or for example, complementizer, I feel like I'm about to faint, I'm not. And remarkable or vernacular like, which is exactly the type of like Carlos was talking about, and I will get into more details about the functions and forms it may take a bit later. And also we know that this distinction is really salient for native speakers of English in the sense that even if there are many, many tokens of unremarkable, like for example, verb to like in a very short text, native speakers do not notice that there were any likes in that sentence because they do not perceive it as something that catches the mind, they just process it for meaning. Oh, sorry, yeah. And now we can move on to what we know so far about like as a linguistic phenomenon. It started to attract attention of linguists in about mid-80s. And now the research on like native speech covers multiple aspects. There are studies on diachronic development, grammaticalization patterns, especially with regard to quoted, it'd be like even phonological realizations of like. So we know a lot about how like developed in English and how it is used by native speakers. So we know that it's ubiquitous in native English speech, and it's and it's this is doing something. Yeah, and we know that it exists in all known varieties of English with maybe differing frequencies, but exists all along. It's ubiquitous and omnipresent in native speech, and it is socially salient and perceived negatively. I would even go ahead and say that it is stigmatized. And I can illustrate it by this nice snippet from CNN. How to like get our kids to stop saying like, and I can find hundreds of similar snippets on the internet if I want to. We also know that a like displays a startling degree of structural promiscuity. I just like that quote and I had to include it in the presentation. But what it really means is that like can perform multiple functions and occupy multiple syntactic positions in a sentence. And this is kind of an important thing. I don't know why my presentation is moving on itself. So, and now I need to describe this structural promiscuity in a little more detail. There are two ways to understand a function. One well-known way is pragmatic, when we think of like as a filler, hesitation marker, or for example as a hedge. But this is not the approach I'm taking. I'm following Darcy in her syntactic functional typology, which is based on the roles and positions in a sentence. And Darcy distinguishes 5 major functions of remarkable like, 4 of them characteristic of American English. Approximative adverb, when like is used before a number or numeric expression, like 100, like 20 people. Quotative complementizer, be like, so I'm like, oh great, thanks. Discourse marker, which occupies, according to Darcy, a clause initial position. Like there is Islamic center right there, so I always go there. It occupies that. In this case, it's sentence initial. It doesn't have to be sentence initial, but it always appears at the beginning of a clause. And discourse particle, which occupies a wide range of clause medial positions, and we have many examples here. And in a lot of like foreign languages, it's not like the same like sentence structure as English. All of these examples are clause medial. There is the 5th function that is not characteristic of American English and appears in Irish English, Northern England, and Scottish, the clause final sentence adverb. And of course, I had to take example not from my own data, but from literature, because people here don't use clause final like. You'd hit the mud on the bottom like. Okay, so the research on like in non-native speech has not been as prominent or as kind of in-depth so far, but we know a few things. So 2 primary contexts in which like has been investigated are immigrant and academic contexts, and the findings in both of them are more or less similar. So we know that most studies find that there is a correlation between how frequently non-native speakers use like and their length of residence and exposure. That depends on they may mean the same thing depending on how researchers investigate it. There is at least some sensitivity to variation, even to syntactic placement of like. For example, studies in Ireland found that people are sensitive to the fact that clause final like is a local constraint. There is also evidence for, in immigrant contexts, of identity construction. In the same studies done in Ireland, there is evidence that men may try to use more clause final likes if they are planning, or people in general, if they are planning to stay in Ireland permanently and therefore are invested in their new Irish identity. More or less the same findings in academic contexts, except nobody looked at identity construction in those contexts so far. But at the same time, there is some anecdotal evidence of stylistic awareness, which means that once in a while, non-native speakers would know that they try to avoid using like, for example, when teaching, because none of the studies in academic context has been done with undergraduate students before. They're all done with either graduate students or a mix of graduate students and, for example, non-native speaking faculty members. And that's pretty much what we know, which makes this present study more or less exploratory in nature. I was not able to make clear predictions about what to expect, except beyond the fact that I expected non-native speakers to use like. But my main purpose was to investigate like as an element of non-native repertoire, kind of in the wide understanding of it. So to move beyond calculating frequencies and just comparing what native speakers do and non-native speakers do in terms of frequency, and look at actual patterns of usage in terms of functions and syntactic placement, to move beyond usage and look at sensitivity to syntactic placement of like. This is important because some functions and some syntactic positions that like occupies in a sentence are rare, and it is difficult to investigate them in usage because you would need tons and tons of speech data to even find a token of it. But using, oh, I'm sorry, I don't know what my presentation is doing. But if we look at from the perception point of view, there is a way to test that sensitivity. And also, I was going to look the non-native beliefs about and attitudes towards like. This is essentially the goals of my study. What I did is I recruited 26 vocal participants, non-native speakers of English, 15 women, 11 men. I had a cutoff point for length of residence, so they all lived here for quite a while, and the mean length of residence was over 40 months. They came from different L1 backgrounds, and they were all highly proficient, as evident from their reported TOEFL or IELTS scores. I did not test for proficiency, but I, didn't really need to in this context. And the fact that it was conducted here at MSU is important because our campus is unique in a sense that over 70% of domestic undergraduates are Michigan residents. They are local, and that ensures the homogeneity of the vernacular spoken here, relative homogeneity, of course, but this is important in terms of what input the non-native speakers are getting. I also recruited native speakers. They were not my focal participants, but I will explain what kind of data I collected from them, and I used a local corpus. And I used a local corpus as well, developed here at the Department of Linguistics, to prepare materials for example, judgment experiment, and as source of native usage patterns. Here's the overview of my procedure. I will not at this point describe the experiments in detail. I will describe them later so that you would not have forgotten by the time I get to the results of them. But overall, the important part is that I met with non-native speakers in person. I interviewed them. It was kind of a short version of a classic sociolinguistic interview. They performed 2 experiments. I will talk about them in details later. And I conducted another interview with them focused on their attitudes towards like when we openly discussed it. Native speakers were not interviewed, but they participated in the same experiments, but online via Qualtrics questionnaire, and they conducted an attitudinal survey within the same survey. So now on to the results, and I begin with the usage data. The first thing I would like to show you is how high the level of individual or variation in the overall frequency of remarkable like in this case in all of its functions is. You can see that some speakers barely used it, produced just a couple tokens, even though none of my participants produced 0 tokens, so I had a few from each, while other speakers produced a lot, and these are normalized frequencies, meaning that they used it a lot. However, despite this high level of individual variation, as a group they behaved remarkably, and this pun intended here, native-like in terms of, if we look at the distribution of like tokens across the functions I talked about. So here the native data were taken from the corpus because I did not interview the participants, but these are essentially the same people, same MSU undergraduates, so I can rely on this data source. What we see here is that, for example, 38.5% of native-like tokens are those of particle-like, and 44.8% of non-native. These are very comparable numbers. The same applies to clause initial marker, 22.7, 25.3, and further on, right? I do not need to read all the numbers, but you see this consistency in terms of the proportion. I had a smaller subset of native data, which is why the token number is different, but proportionally, this is I was quite surprised to see that. Furthermore, if we move further into the syntactic structure and look at like tokens by function, this stability remains. So here I Unfortunately, I do not have time to explain in detail this syntactic context. I can explain it later, but you see examples. And the main idea is that Darcy found for native data that matrix CP and subordinate CP contexts are well established in the English language and old and therefore supposed to be frequent in at least native speech, while subordinate TP context is new and trending, and we would expect much fewer tokens of it in the speech, and this is exactly what we see. We see that the number of tokens, of matrix CP tokens, is 83%, 74%, 15 and 19 here, and much less subordinate, likes in the subordinate TP context. So this, I don't know what's happening. So this similarity of patterning remains. And another example, just very briefly, from the clause medial particle context, we see the same. There is the well-established and old context of like preceding a determinative phrase, and we see a very similar proportion of such tokens in native and non-native data. And we see a new context like preceding noun phrase, and also much smaller proportion of tokens. Okay, so, but we still need to, and I still need to explain the that high level of interspeaker variation. That high level of interspeaker variation. So I found that there is some influence of gender. Women use like more frequently. I did not find evidence of length of residence, region of origin, friendship network, or intention to stay in the US to be factors. For length of residence, that's probably because I had that cutoff point and I did not look at a wide range of lengths of residences. But what I did find was that actually beliefs played an important part. In looking for that, I was inspired by mounting evidence that socially salient variables, other than like in multiple languages, may be reinterpreted by non-native speakers as representing Britishness or Frenchness or Americanness, kind of the essence of their target language country, and therefore they would tend to overuse it in a context where native speakers would actually not use it due to stigma. And even though I don't have a perfect correlation, all top users identified like as an American phenomenon, and that was much less so with the less frequent users. As I said, I also did syntactic judgments that allows for kind of more fine-grained look at the minor functions of like, and I also found native like patterning. So the experiment itself consisted of sentences presented orally and a simple instruction to judge how natural each sentence sounded. Some of them contained like, I will talk about them. I also had several categories without like that I used to kind of validate the design. Basically, I expected native and non-native speakers to judge the perfectly grammatical sentences as natural, and for example, ungrammatical containing mistakes as unnatural, and this is what I found. I won't go into these details, but what I found supported this idea. So I proceeded to look at likes. I will not report all the details, and the important thing is that non-native speakers were much more accepting overall, and they provided higher ratings across the board, so it didn't make a lot of sense to just run statistical tests on actual ratings. Instead, I compared the order of naturalness established by native and non-native speakers. And I found that, for example, the tokens of approximator like, which is the oldest and well-established function, are ranked very high by both groups, but non-local tokens of clause final like, which does not appear in American English, are judged low. If we look at, for example, the matrix CP, subordinate CP, and subordinate TP context, we also find that the older contexts are judged higher in naturalness than the newer contexts by both groups, which supports the idea that non-native speakers are sensitive to these constraints. So to conclude this part I can say that non-native speakers do use like. The cross-function distributions are similar in native and non-native data, and also non-native speakers are sensitive to syntactic placement of like. Interspeaker variation is high and cannot be easily explained, but beliefs might matter here. There definitely needs to be more research done in that respect. And now on to beliefs and attitudes themselves. So native beliefs about like were not investigated much. There was only one study, but what I found supported the findings of this study overall. For native speakers, like is mainly a filler word, stigmatized, should be avoided in formal situation. People who use like are perceived as uneducated, unintelligent, and uncertain, and the overwhelming majority of native speakers heard negative comments about like or were chastised for using it in their own speech. And people are, unsurprisingly, much more likely to report that other people of the same age use it frequently than they use it themselves. So that's kind of the ground against which I looked at non-native speakers. For non-native speakers, more or less none of that was that important. The most important theme that emerged was that like was a signal of Americanness. Here's just one quote, but I heard it times and times again, and I provided quotes in the dissertation. Among other things, even talking about other non-native speakers who use like, my participants were likely to say that, okay, those people are first highly proficient, they probably socialize with Americans, and they have been here for a while. Again, even other non-native speakers who use like are probably kind of Americanized. I found evidence of people using like, consciously using like as an identity building tool in order to blend in and relate into the culture here. However, I found very low level of stylistic awareness. Very few non-native speakers said that like should be avoided in any context, and most of these few were actually participants of some public speaking activities and were overtly instructed to avoid it. So they were kind of reporting that knowledge rather than their intuitions. However, their meta-linguistic awareness was high. It wasn't just a filler for them. They were quite aware of a wide range of functions, pragmatic functions like can perform. Then I looked at the attitudes, and for that I conducted a matched skies experiment, which I need to explain a little bit for the non-variationist sociolinguists here. So the idea is that an oral sample of speech, some story, some text is presented in two versions. One version is, in my case, that was the original taken from the local corpus, containing tokens of remarkable like. The other version is pretty much the same text without any tokens of like in it. Of course, one story in one guise is presented to a single listener only once, so just in different order, and I had 6 such stories, 4 narrated by women, 2 narrated by men. Texts were taken from the local corpus, and they were re-recorded by actors who mimicked the intonation patterns and made a pretty good job of it. If we have time later, I will let you listen to that, but just not now for the sake of time. And my participants looked at that twice. First time, they were asked to profile the speaker, just jot down on a piece of paper what they think, or on the computer, what they think about the speaker. And the second part, they were presented with the same stories and guises in a different order, and they were given certain adjectives such as friendly, intelligent, and so on, and they were asked to say how well they characterize the speaker on a 1 to 5 Likert scale. What I found using this experiment is that in the first task, the profiling task, certain social personae emerged, especially for some profiles. There were 2 very distinct profiles. 2 speakers were profiled as sorority girls and 1 man as a frat guy by both native and non-native speakers. And there were some lighter profiles, I will get to that later, which came in very, very handy when I had to explain the statistical results that I received when I looked at the attribute-based ratings, and received, as you can see, a lot of significant main effects and interactions. And I had to make some sense of it. I did. Just a bit of kind of explanation of what you see here. On the left, you see the adjectives, the attributes. On here, you see the speakers, and I just colored the gender in the most kind of classic way possible. A tick means that the presence of like in this story had a positive effect on the perception of the speaker. So for example, if you see a tick here, it means that speaker 1 was perceived as friendlier in their like guise than in their bear guise. And speaker 2 was perceived as less friendly when like was present in his speech. So when I looked at that, certain nice things emerged. So we see that for some speakers, a presence of like actually makes them sound more positive across the board with regard to pretty much all attributes. And coincidentally, both of these speakers were profiled as sorority girls. And this is probably something that was expected from a sorority girl, to use like. For some other speakers, the presence of like had an overall negative effect. And those were the frat guy, the nerdy girl, and the girl next door. The only speaker who you see kind of a lot of disagreement here, he was not distinctly profiled. There was kind of a weak profile of possibly an artistic guy, possibly a gay guy, but nothing very kind of non-native, and native and non-native speakers were not entirely sure, and you see that here. They couldn't also interpret what kind of effect like had on him because they probably had not any expectations with regard to that. And also, this has some implications for match-guys research in general, but I would also like to point out how similar the native and non-native ratings are. They are incredibly similar in terms of, even though that this pattern is intricate, it's not just the presence of like makes all of them sounds, let's say, more friendly and less intelligent. That's not the case at all. And so non-native speakers demonstrate overwhelming awareness of the like phenomenon. Popular beliefs that like is stigmatized are relevant for native speakers, very much so, but not so much for non-native speakers. For native speakers, like signals informal context. For non-native speakers, mostly it signals Americanness. There is no uniform like effect, positive or negative. It rather depends on the social persona of speakers, and especially female social persona tend to be divided into those expected to use like as sorority girls, or probably not expected as nerdy girls, and that would kind of predict the effect, the overall effect of like, and the agreement between native and non-native speakers in their attitude is pretty astonishing. To recap the entire dissertation and to kind of underscore the most important findings. Non-native speakers pattern with native speakers in usage, syntactic judgments, and even attitude, that intricate pattern of attitudinal judgments. Non-native speakers recognize like a socially salient. They all start nodding when I ask, do you understand what I'm talking about? But their level of stylistic awareness is low, and they did not necessarily understand the stigma attached to it, which brings about an important pedagogical implication for classroom that probably we kind of need to raise awareness of that, because some research suggests that using like in formal situations may even lower your chances to get a job, and that is pretty important in real life. And because this study was exploratory, there was, of course, a lot of limitations to it, but I prefer to think about them as kind of directions for future research. And it would be incredibly interesting to see either similar study with different population, for example, with immigrants, or probably even more interesting, a developmental study, because I could not focus on the development of these judgment patterns, or usage patterns, or attitudes, but and I kind of captured that in a moment, but it would be very interesting to see how those things developed. Thank you very much, and I would like to thank, first of all, my committee and my advisors. Also, I would like to thank Dr. Derek McNish from the theater department and wonderful volunteer actors who helped me prepare materials, my colleagues from SOCLab and SocialLab student organizations, my friends, family, and my husband. And we can discuss, yes, with a nice picture here. I also have extra slides with more information it becomes necessary. Thank you.
Okay, I guess we'll start off with questions from the committee members.